In November 1943, RAF Bomber Command began a series of offensive operations against Berlin. Sir Arthur Harris, Air Officer commanding Bomber Command, told Winston Churchill that German resistance would be broken by the raids. "It will cost us 400 to 500 bombers," he said. "It will cost Germany the war." On the night of January 26, 1944, several hundred bombers were dispatched to Berlin, including aircraft of 408 Squadron, 6th Group RCAF, part of RAF Bomber Command. Records for that night indicate 33 Lancasters were lost. One of these aircraft was a Lancaster II of 408 Squadron, EQP serial number DS709, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Eldon Curl of Cardston, Alberta. Located in the low foothills of southwest Alberta, a short distance from the Montana border, Cardston is like many other small Alberta towns. In the center of the town is the cenotaph, erected after the First World War to commemorate those from the Cardston area who died during that terrible conflict. A small bronze plaque was added to the cenotaph to commemorate 50 men from the area who died during the Second World War. Of those who died, 60% were serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force at the time of their deaths. Among the thousands of sons and daughters of Alberta who served in Canada's armed forces during the Second World War, Cardston and surrounding communities provided their fair share. Two of Cardston's own, Eldon Easton Curl and his younger brother Harold Enders Curl, served overseas as bomber pilots. Eldon with 408 Squadron flying the Lancaster Mark II, and Harold with 432 Squadron flying the Handley Page Halifax Mark VII. Harold would eventually return home to his family in Cardston. Eldon would not. This is their story. The Curl family came to southern Alberta from Utah in the early 1900s, where George Curl homesteaded a small ranch near Cardston. Eldon and Harold, two sons of George and Rose Anders Curl, were born, raised, and educated in the community, along with their brothers and sisters. In September 1939, the world was once again at war. Following graduation from high school, Eldon worked as a tailor until mid-1941 when he served in the Army during the summer, only to enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force in Edmonton on September 5, 1941. Eldon Curl would spend a month at No. 3 Manning Depot in Edmonton before he was transferred to No. 15 Service Flying Training School at Claresholm, not far from his home in Cardston. 1 month later, he moved to No. 7 Initial Training School in Saskatoon for basic training and aircrew selection. On February 2, 1942, Eldon was transferred to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where he joined No. 6 Elementary Flight Training School. On February 16th, he had his first flight in Tiger Moth No. 4057. Less than 1 month after beginning his flight training, Eldon soloed for the first time.
Got up at 6:30 hours. Flew this morning. Had my first solo. Made 4 attempts to land. Landed it on the 4th.
Following his basic flight training, Eldon reported to No. 7 Service Flight Training School at McLeod for flight training on the twin-engine Avro Anson Mark II, a prerequisite for bomber pilots.
Had first solo in Avro Anson. Was down over Cardston in an Anson and really shot it up.
On August 1st, 1942, Eldon Curl received his pilot's wings and a promotion to sergeant. In early November of that year, Curl arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia for transport overseas to England, a trip that would take him by train to St. John, New Brunswick and New York.
The bed on the train was very hard. Arrived in New York. Saw the Empire State Building.
Then on to the liner Queen Elizabeth for a transatlantic crossing.
Left New York this morning. Steamed past the Statue of Liberty and out into the Atlantic Ocean. followed by enemy subs last night. We ran into heavy seas. The ship was heaving and rolling all night.
Following time at an advanced flying unit, he was transferred to a heavy conversion unit at Leeming, Yorkshire. Within a month, his training completed, Eldon Curl received a commission as an officer and joined 408 Squadron 6 Group, RCAF, also at Leeming. 6 weeks later, the squadron moved to Linton-on-Ouse, Yorkshire. Nearly 21 months had passed since Eldon had joined the RCAF. Eldon began flying the Handley Page Halifax on operations over enemy territory almost immediately. Near the end of July 1943, Eldon flew on operations 6 nights out of 7, 4 times against Hamburg. His aircraft was EQP P for Peter. He later flew a Lancaster II with the same squadron code and name when the squadron re-equipped in October 1943. On January 26, 1944, Eldon celebrated his 24th birthday. He and his crew had already completed 17 operations over enemy territory, including a number of raids against Berlin, known to aircrews as the Big City. Lancaster EQP P for Peter lifted off from Linton-on-Ouse just before 6 p.m. to join other aircraft for that night's operation. Canadian squadrons would lose 8 aircraft. 3 would be from 408 Squadron. For Flight Lieutenant Curl and his crew, which included Pilot Officer E.R. Proud, Pilot Officer A.C. Brown, Pilot Officer J.P.D. Parise, Flight Sergeant A. Smith, Pilot Officer J. Adamson, Flight Sergeant J. A. McLean, and Flight Sergeant J. F. McManus. The night of January 26th would be their 18th operation, more than halfway through their tour of operations. The target was once again Berlin.
On course, Skipper. 15 seconds.
Is it always like this? Any chance we can avoid that area over there?
There it is, boys. The Big City. It's all yours, Alf. Bomb doors open.
Okay, Skip. Got it. Steady now. Steady. Steady. Hold her there. Bomb's gone.
Shortly after dropping their bombs over Berlin, P for Peter was attacked by a German night fighter.
Corkscrew starboard. Go! I can see him. JU-88. He's turning into us.
Taking evasive action, Flight Lieutenant Curl hoped to lose the attacker in the dark. Cannon and machine gun fire ripped through the fuselage and starboard wing, killing the bomb aimer Flight Sergeant A. Smith. Shrapnel hit the flight engineer, Pilot Officer Alfie Brown, knocking him unconscious. With the 2 starboard engines on fire, Eldon would have known his aircraft was doomed. His responsibility would be to save his crew.
I can't hold her much longer. We're going down. Everybody out, now! I'll try to hold her steady. Get out!
During the turmoil and confusion, one of the crew managed to strap a parachute to the still unconscious flight engineer and push him out of the flaming Lancaster. Pilot Officer Alfie Brown would be the only survivor of Eldon Curl's crew. The aircraft came down in the Reichenwald area, approximately 4 kilometers east of Storkow, near the small village of Buck, in what would become the Soviet-occupied zone of East Germany. Flight Lieutenant Eldon Eastham Curl died that night on his 24th birthday, along with 6 of his crew. His body and those of 4 others were located and buried near the site of the crash. 3 others would never be found. They would join nearly 10,000 other Canadians who died during the Second World War, serving with Bomber Command of the Royal Air Force. On the day he died, Flight Lieutenant Curl was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation for his award reads, "This officer has completed as pilot and captain of aircraft many successful operations against the enemy, in the course of which he has invariably displayed high skill, fortitude, and devotion to duty." Born on December 10, 1922, nearly 3 years after Eldon, Harold Enders Curl grew up with his family in Cardston. Following graduation from high school, the 19-year-old would follow his brother into the Royal Canadian Air Force, enlisting in October 1942, a little more than a year after his older brother. Harold completed basic training at No. 3 Manning Depot in Edmonton, after which he transferred to No. 5 Elementary Flight Training School at High River, south of Calgary, for basic flight training. From High River, Harold was sent to No. 15 Service Flying Training School at Claresholm, where, like his brother before him, he trained on twin-engine Avro Ansons. 2 weeks before receiving his pilot's wings, Harold learned of the death on operations of his brother, Flight Lieutenant Eldon Eastham Curl. Following commando training at Valleyfield, Quebec, Harold Curl left Montreal by train for Halifax, Nova Scotia, from where he went overseas. Following advanced flight training, Harold flew the twin-engine Wellington bomber to gain operational experience, after which his piloting skills were assessed as being above the average. By December, a little more than 2 years since he enlisted, Harold was flying Halifax bombers with No. 1664 Heavy Conversion Unit at Dishforth in Yorkshire. On February 23, 1945, he joined 432 Squadron at Eastmoor, where he flew Halifax Mark 7 aircraft. By the end of the war in Europe, May 8, 1945, Flying Officer Harold Curl had flown 17 operations over enemy territory, the same number as his brother, up to the time of his death over a year earlier. Even though Harold joined his squadron near the end of the war, operations were still dangerous, with aircraft being destroyed and crews lost almost on a nightly basis. On the night of March 22nd, while on operations over Dorsten, Harold's aircraft suffered the loss of 1 engine. Rather than turning back, he pressed home his attack on 3 engines at a reduced altitude of 14,000 feet. On March 25th, just 3 nights later over Munster, while flying Halifax QOW Willie the Wolf, Harold's aircraft suffered a near miss from anti-aircraft gunfire. While not a direct hit, a piece of shrapnel came up through the bottom of the aircraft, striking his parachute harness and ricocheting out the side of the aircraft just below the pilot's window. The Halifax carried only 1 pilot. Had Harold been seriously wounded or killed, his crew would have had little choice except to abandon their aircraft over enemy territory.
One of my flights was in Munster, Germany. When a piece of flak came through, the belly of the aircraft came up by my shoulder, cut the parachute strap, and went out through the cuppy top of Willie the Wolf. I shall always remember that, and especially my crew that didn't know how to fly.
3 weeks after the cessation of hostilities on June 2, 1945, Harold Curl would once again fly Willie the Wolf.
I had the opportunity to take Willie the Wolf for its last flight. It was a good day, but a sad day in that it's the last time that Willie the Wolf ever flew. I flew it to a small aerodrome near York called Dalton. There it was stripped of its parts, bulldozed and burned. What a sad day, what a sad ending to an aircraft which had done so much.
Unlike thousands of Canadian airmen, soldiers, and sailors, Harold Curl chose to stay in Europe following the end of the war. From 432 Squadron, Harold transferred to 424 Squadron, flying Lancaster aircraft on low-level patrols over Allied-occupied Germany, including the Ruhr Valley, Cologne, and other cities. In the fall of 1945, Flying Officer Curl joined 437 Squadron, flying Dakota transport aircraft carrying mail, freight, and passengers on routes that included Brussels, Hamburg, Prague, Naples, Copenhagen, and Berlin. In order to help bring closure to his family over the loss of their son and brother Eldon 2 years earlier, Harold Curl knew he would have to go to Berlin. His journey of discovery began at Allied Supreme Headquarters, where he met a Colonel McQueen. While willing to assist, McQueen recognized he had no authority outside his own chain of command, so he suggested Harold meet with Canadian Army Lieutenant General Maurice Pope, head of the Canadian military mission in Berlin. After hearing of Harold's determination to enter the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany to find his brother, General Pope gave approval, but not in writing. That was left up to Colonel McQueen, who, along with his secretary, Alla Jacobs, worked with Harold to script and type a letter in Russian, which he signed and affixed an official-looking stamp in red ink. Nearly a year after the end of the war in Europe, armed only with a bogus letter, and having been provided with an RAF staff car, a driver and translator, Flying Officer Curl crossed through the Brandenburg Gate. Based on information provided to his family by the International Red Cross following the downing of Eldon's aircraft, Harold headed for the Reichenwald area of Soviet-occupied East Germany and the small farming community of Buck, the crash site of Lancaster EQP P for Peter. Ravished by years of war, the German countryside was still considered unsettled and dangerous. It was not long before Harold encountered a Soviet army patrol, which stopped the car and demanded identification.
Stop the doing! Take it. Read it. Look at this!
When none of the soldiers could read the letter presented to them, Harold was taken to a Russian captain who grasped the situation and, because of the official-looking nature of the letter, gave the group permission to travel on to Buck. The arrival of Canadian airmen was bound to create interest. Determined to find his brother, Harold went to a local Gasthaus where he met Karl Koenig, a farmer from the area. Koenig had seen the burning Lancaster, went to the crash site, and discovered the bodies of 4 of the crew, including Eldon Curl, and buried them near where their aircraft fell. The remains of a 5th crew member was found 3 weeks after the crash and buried with his comrades. Koenig erected crosses at the site, but was forced to remove them before the war's end. He continued to tend the site for the last months of the war and was still doing so in May 1946. Harold Curl had reached his objective. On visiting the common gravesite with Karl Koenig, Harold spent a few moments in silent recollection and prayer, came to attention, and saluted the resting place of his fallen brother. 3 of the crew of EQP P for Peter were never found. Following the end of the Second World War, the bodies of Eldon and 4 of his crew were moved to Charlottenburg Commonwealth Cemetery in Berlin. Today, simple granite headstones mark their final resting place. Flight Lieutenant Eldon Eastham Curl, DFC, is far from Cardston, Alberta, but remains connected to his family through the efforts of his brother, Harold Curl. They are, to this day, brothers in arms.